Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Savannah J. Goins, author of The Gwythinian and the Crevibanian, and today I have with me the lovely Renee Dugan, author of Chaos Circus, Darkwind, and Dawnstar, and we're going to talk today about planning a series. How do you plan a book series? Should you plan the whole series out before you write the first book or before you publish the first book? We're going to answer all these questions for you in this video today. All right, so Renee and I are both in the process of writing a book series. And Renee's actually written quite a few book series yet that are not published yet, but she has a lot of experience writing book series. So we're going to learn a lot from her today about that. So first, let's talk about the benefits of planning a book series ahead of time. So Renee, in all your experience of writing many book series, what can you tell us about the benefits of planning a series ahead of time?
So I think the number one thing is knowing where you're going to go helps you to get there in a way that makes sense. When I first started writing, I should say when I first started successfully finishing books, because I have a lot of series that never ended, my biggest problem was I didn't really know where I was going, and so the beats along the way a lot of times went everywhere and made no sense. So I found that the biggest benefit to planning the series ahead of time is that it helps you to have a continuous stream of thought and no discrepancies along the way.
Yes, I agree. I've only written the one book series so far, but I've gotten better at planning as I've gone, and I can definitely say the amount of non-planning I did in the beginning has caused so many problems for fixing things along the way. So some of the things that can go wrong when you don't plan a series would be you can run out of conflicts if you solve all the problems. Sometimes it's easy to make them up for a next book, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you wrap everything up so well in the first one or two books that now there's like no material to work with for book three. And sometimes I've read books, published books in series that clearly were meant to end at a certain point. There's one I'm thinking of in particular that I will not name, but that was meant to end at book three, and because it was selling well, my theory is publishers were like, we're gonna make another book out of this at least and get more money for it. So I understand the importance of making money in the book industry, of course, as an author. However, sometimes it can just come off contrived and like you were just trying to write another book in the series because it was successful. And if you can do that well, then it's worth it. But if you have not planned for it to be that long, sometimes it's really hard to pull it off well. And I've seen some books that I've been really disappointed in when they've just forced another book out of it, or like sometimes that just doesn't really turn out very well. Another thing, especially when you're starting out, is the main character's arc. Characters are going to change throughout the book, particularly the main character. How are they going to change? If I had outlined my whole series well, I kind of had outlined the whole thing, but not really. So if I had actually outlined it well, like I would now, I would have done my main character's arc a little bit differently. She would have grown a lot more in the beginning, and had some other things to learn along the way later on, because I actually had the opposite problem here than what I described a minute ago. It would have been better for her to grow more in the beginning. It would have been more satisfying of an arc in the first book. But the way that I thought to plan a series would be that she wouldn't learn those things until book three, and it really stretched things out. So I think one way that I could have improved on that would have been to have taught her all those things in the first book and have her come out a much more strong for the second book, and then have other things to learn in the second and third book. That's one thing I would do differently. But we'll get into some more things we do differently in a minute. But let's talk about some methods to avoid these things. How can you plan a book series well, even if it's your first book series and you have no idea what you're doing, like me when I first started? So Renee, tell us some things, some methods that you use to avoid these kind of problems that we've seen in some books.
Absolutely. So one of the big things that I do is I try to have what I like to call guardrails around my series. So I try to have a very good idea of how the world works, like religious things, world building in terms of how characters talk, how they interact with their world. And then I like to go with each of my main characters, and I like to have an idea when I start out, what is the lesson that this character needs to learn? Because for me, every series that I've ever enjoyed, like thoroughly enjoyed start to finish, had a main character who had not just like one lesson that they had to learn in one book, but an overarching, like you were saying, Savannah, an arc that they have to go through over the course of the series. So while, especially for traditionally published books, a lot of times what publishers are looking for is a story, at least a first book, that can be, one and done, page open, page close, everything's solved in the first book. You want to at least lay down some hints of something
Yes.
else that the character is going to have to deal with in later books. I'll give just an example from one of mine in Darkwind, which is the first book in the Star Chaser saga. When Sistine, the main character, first sets off on her quest, she's extremely naive and does not want to really do anything for herself, including stand up and fight for herself.
Mm-hmm.
So in the first book, she has to learn the value of fighting for herself and others. That's taken care of in the first book, but there's still things that she needs to learn along the way in other books. And so that is, I think, one of the key things is making sure that your characters have individual arcs for each book that they can go through, but also an overarching arc or lesson that they need to learn over the course of the series. You kind of want to get them from point A to point B, if you will. So making sure that you have things planned for each book, lessons they have to learn in each book of your trilogy or series to make sure that the reader continues to engage. I think that's really the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. And along those same lines, it's really important to have the arc for each book and the overarching arc figured out. You don't want to leave that too much, like you don't have to have everything figured out, but you don't want to leave that too undefined, because in order for somebody to get to what's going to be a really satisfying ending at the end of my 3 books, they have to get through what might be a slightly less satisfying character arc earlier on. But if I had done it better, she would have grown more in the first book, so they would for sure stick around for the whole series. But if you do that too loosely, then you may have a really satisfying ending in the 3rd book, but are people going to get there? So that's something that is really important to make sure that you have somewhat planned along the way.
Another one I want to say is know why your villain is doing what your villain is doing. I had a series that eventually I'm probably going to have to go back and rewrite the first book if I can ever bring myself to. It was actually a duology with a trilogy following, and the second book in the duology and the whole trilogy are great, but unfortunately I can't do anything with them because when I first wrote the first book in the duology back, 2012 I think it was my first time really putting effort into writing a villain, and I had no idea what I was doing. So my villain, or you can also say antagonist, their motives made no sense, and so it made the hero's journey not make sense, and then the whole book didn't make sense and everything fell apart. So I would say another thing to watch out for is make sure that whatever conflict your character is running up against, it's A, not easily solved, and B, makes sense within the world so that you don't run into, well, wait, why is there even a conflict? They could just do X, Y, and Z and everything would be solved and it would be fine. So just making sure that, again, that's kind of a guardrail. You want to make sure that you have a good structure around your books so that everything holds up and stays true going forward.
And you could leave yourselves those kind of breadcrumbs about future conflicts, future villains, or other conflicts with that same villain for potential future books, if you know how they're going to tie up and then what they could be in the future as you're planning your whole series.
Absolutely.
So Renee, tell me how your process has changed for writing books as you have been writing so many series for so many years now.
Well, I actually have one now. That's the biggest thing that's changed. Like I said, when I first started off, I didn't really know what I was doing with writing series, so I just sort of threw spaghetti at the wall to see what stuck. One of the things that I do now is I really try to have an idea of where I'm opening and where I'm closing. And then that makes it a little easier to figure out things in between. But sometimes those details will change because I write exploratory drafts. So I'll learn about my characters and my world, and a lot of times my vision will change. But the biggest way that my process, I think, has changed is rather than needing to go in and just pants it, as they say, and just figure it out as I go, I'm finding that having a structure around it from the start, knowing this is where my hero or my main character, my protagonist, is going to start, and this is where I want them to be by the end, has really evolved and grown. So I would say that's probably the biggest one.
Okay, that's a great advice. I have only written the one series so far. What I can tell you though, how my process has changed from just throwing spaghetti at the wall and trying to figure things out for one book at a time or the whole series, I've started using the Save the Cat method to outline books, and that has been so helpful. I have a book that I'm querying right now that I literally just wrote in November, but because it was the 6th book I had written and because I was able to use that outline method, I was able to not have a whole lot of revising to do compared to the past. It didn't take me a year to revise it. I revised it for like a month and a half and then got feedback from one of my critique groups and some other critique partners and got it in really good shape really fast because I used that outlining method that saved me from stupid revisions later from, like the normal amount of tons and tons of revisions. So what I will do the next time I write a series would be to use the Save the Cat method to outline all the books. There's also some talk about using the Save the Cat method in some way overarching multiple books. I think that that could potentially result in having like the same unsatisfactory character growth earlier on, to where maybe your ending is going to be really good, but are people going to get there would be the question. So what I would do in the future is use that to outline things. The 2 books that I've written using the Save the Cat method, I have left myself breadcrumbs at the end to then add future books, but I have not outlined all the other books because I want to query those. And as you probably know, when you're trying to get a traditional book deal, writing the whole series is not really in your best interest, because they might not want to buy the next book. And when you're first starting out, you're better off writing in some different worlds or other books that can be sold separately, because you want to have a standalone with series potential. So both of these other 2 books that I've written are standalones with series potential. There's things that would make people want to read the next book at the end, but they could also be satisfactory endings, even if those other things that could potentially get answered don't get answered. So you want to make sure that you're careful about not leaving like a complete cliffhanger, but you want to be able to leave some things that you could go back and work on. And if you're self-publishing, then what I would do is go ahead and outline multiple books with the Save the Cat method.
I want to add to that too. I think Save the Cat is absolutely fantastic for this. And I have not actually used Save the Cat for series, but I will say that if you find that you're somebody who struggles with outlining, and I can't really go into a draft knowing that much about it. Another thing that can help, and this is something I've learned in my process, is actually to do a post outline where you write the book and then you go ahead and review it and look for, okay, this is what happens in this chapter, this is what happens in this chapter. That helped a lot with my process when I started looking at the book and figuring out where the beats were once I was done with the book. And that helped me to catch where I was missing things, like a dark night of the soul or something like that. So if you feel a little bit intimidated about starting out with an outline, you can always go back and use Save the Cat as something that you compare your draft to and find where you're missing those critical beats.
And you might be able to learn enough from that to then use that method to try to go ahead and outline before drafting other parts of the book. But
yep.
Yeah. Okay, so the last question we're going to answer is, how much of your series should you plan ahead? So we're probably going to have a little bit different of answers, because I'm more of an outliner and Renee is more of an exploratory writer. So no matter which one you are, we've got an answer for you.
So for me, what I always try to do, and this does not work for everybody, I try to actually not just plan the series, but I try to write most of it before I ever look at like publishing or querying a first book. In terms of how much I do before I start writing, I generally like to know the overall plot of each book in the series. So to use Star Chasers as an example, I knew where the first book was going to start and where it was going to end. I knew what the overarching plot of book 2 needed to be. So I knew, therefore, that this is where book 1 needs to stop, and I could figure out the steps that needed to happen in that book based on that. I have another series that I wrote where I basically didn't plan most of it before I started, and it ended up growing from 3 books to 5 books. So you will find that, if you don't do a good amount of planning ahead of time, the book can start to get away from you. So my recommendation, even if you're an exploratory drafter, is just know where you want to start and where you want to stop each book and what you want kind of the overall lesson or theme of each book to be. That will help you catch if you're starting to stray a little too far. Maybe your book needs to end so that this detail can go into the next book.
As for how much of a series do you need to plan ahead, I think what I would say is, I would reiterate, using Save the Cat for me to plan multiple books would be the way to go. I would probably, if I knew that I wanted the series to go for longer, I would try to outline some more books before I was finished writing the last book that I had outlined, just to make sure that they could all be really cohesive. Because even for the Gwythinian, I wrote the Gwythinian and I had a little bit of ideas for the Creevebanian and the Cathawir. And then right before I published the Gwythinian, I had at least written an outline for the Cathawir. together. So I had a rough draft of the second book and an outline for the third book. So that helped me to really make sure that it really helped me with some of the villain things, to make sure that I had some of that figured out. So I would say, at least if you think you're going to go longer than the maybe 3 books you originally outlined, maybe just experiment with outlining the fourth book, what it might be. Like, do you really need that in the series? If you do, great. And now you might be able to plant some seeds and things earlier on in the book that will give some fun aha moments, or, will make book 4 be better than some of those series where book 4 was clearly just a thing they tacked on the end. So you don't want to do that. But even if you say you've already written a series, it's already published, and you want to write book 4, if it's because your fans are screaming for it or because it's just something that you really want to do, I'm totally not saying you shouldn't do that. I think you should just be really careful to make sure that you weave things from the original book in and from the original series, and just try to make it all blend really well and not just be like a tacked on extra book. Okay, so let us know your thoughts in the comments. Have you outlined a series before? Have you written a series? What do you think about outlining the whole series ahead of time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And Renee's books are all going to be linked along with all her socials below, so make sure you check those out. She's very cool. You should follow her. She posts some great tips, writerly tips, and fun prompts and things, so you would definitely want to go check her out, especially on Instagram. And until next time, we will see you guys next week. Bye!